At 3:17 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the first wave of napalm canisters erupted across the cave entrances of Iwo Jima. The jellied gasoline didn't just burn, it clung. It stuck to rock, to metal, to flesh. And it burned at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, turning concrete bunkers into ovens, and enemy positions into crematoriums. Inside those caves, Japanese soldiers who had survived months of conventional bombing were experiencing a new kind of hell. A hell invented by a 32-year-old Harvard chemistry professor named Louis Pfizer, who 6 months earlier had been laughed out of a Pentagon briefing room for suggesting they fight fire with fire. The problem facing the United States military in early 1944 was brutally simple. The Japanese weren't fighting like Europeans. They weren't holding lines that could be pushed back with artillery. They were disappearing underground. On every island, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, American Marines were dying by the thousands, trying to root out an enemy that lived in caves, in tunnels, in fortified positions that laughed at conventional explosives. A standard bomb would detonate, create a shockwave, and move on. The Japanese would wait in their holes, let the explosion pass over them, and pop back up to resume firing. Flamethrowers worked, but their range was pathetic, 30 feet maximum. To use one, you had to get close enough to smell the enemy, and by then, you were already in the kill zone of his machine gun. The casualty rate for flamethrower operators was approaching 90%. They were walking targets, carrying tanks of pressurized fuel on their backs. One bullet in the right place, and they became human torches. The generals knew they needed something different. They needed fire that could reach farther, burn longer, and most importantly, fire that couldn't be avoided. Fire that would flow into tunnels like water, following every curve, filling every void, and cooking everything inside. But nobody knew how to make fire do that. Regular gasoline was too thin. It evaporated too quickly. It burned fast and fierce for about 10 seconds, and then it was gone. By January 1944, the casualty projections for the upcoming invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were nightmare fuel. Conservative estimates predicted 50,000 American dead. Some analysts whispered numbers as high as 100,000. The problem wasn't Japanese soldiers. It was Japanese holes. Every cave was a fortress. Every tunnel was a death trap. And the United States military had no weapon in its arsenal that could reliably clear them without sending men inside to die. Louis Pfizer was not a soldier. He was a professor, a quiet, bookish man who spent his days teaching organic chemistry to undergraduates at Harvard University. He wore thick glasses. He had ink stains on his fingers. He looked like someone who should be grading papers, not designing instruments of war. But Pfizer had a specialty that made him invaluable. He understood hydrocarbons. He understood how molecules bonded, how substances mixed, and most importantly, he understood combustion at a level that bordered on art. When the War Department sent out a call for scientists to help with the tunnel problem, Pfizer volunteered immediately. He wasn't motivated by patriotism alone. He had lost a nephew at Tarawa. The boy had been 20 years old, a private in the Marines. He had been killed trying to clear a bunker with a satchel charge. The charge had failed to penetrate deep enough. The Japanese inside had survived and shot the nephew as he retreated. Pfizer wanted revenge, but more than that, he wanted to make sure no other mother received the telegram that his sister had received. His idea was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. He wanted to turn gasoline into jelly. Not liquid, not solid, something in between. A substance that would stick to surfaces like glue, but burn like fuel. He started experimenting in his laboratory at Harvard in March 1944. His first attempts were disasters. He tried mixing gasoline with rubber, but it created a substance so thick it wouldn't flow out of a container. He tried adding soap, but it separated when heated. He tried dozens of compounds, filling his lab with toxic fumes that made his graduate students refuse to enter the building. The university administration told him to stop. They said he was wasting time and resources on a fantasy. They said fire was fire, and you couldn't fundamentally change its nature. Pfizer ignored them. He kept mixing, kept testing, kept failing. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in April, he stumbled onto the answer. He combined gasoline with aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate, two obscure compounds that nobody had thought to pair together. When he mixed them in the right proportions, something magical happened. The gasoline thickened into a gel that had the consistency of honey. It poured slowly. It stuck to surfaces, and when he lit it on fire in a steel bucket in the basement of his lab, it burned for over 2 minutes without spreading. The flame didn't jump around wildly like normal gasoline. It stayed put. It clung to the metal surface of the bucket and refused to let go. Pfizer stared at the burning gel with his heart pounding. He had done it. He had created a substance that defied the normal rules of combustion. He called it napalm, a portmanteau of the two aluminum compounds that made it work. When Pfizer presented his findings to the War Department in May 1944, the reaction was not what he expected. The generals looked at his small glass jar of gel. They looked at the chemical formulas on his blackboard. They looked at him, this mild-mannered professor with chalk dust on his jacket. And they laughed. Not polite laughter. Not nervous laughter. Real, genuine mockery. A colonel from the Army Air Corps stood up and asked Pfizer if he seriously expected them to drop jelly on the enemy. Another officer made a joke about spreading napalm on toast. The room erupted. They thought it was absurd. They thought Pfizer had wasted government funding on a science experiment that belonged in a high school classroom, not on a battlefield. Fire was fire, they said. Making it sticky didn't change anything fundamental. It was a gimmick, a novelty. They already had incendiary bombs that worked perfectly fine. They had white phosphorus grenades. They had flamethrowers. Why did they need jelly? Pfizer tried to explain. He tried to show them the mathematics of burn duration and surface adhesion. He tried to explain that napalm wouldn't just burn hotter, it would burn smarter. It would flow into spaces that regular fire couldn't reach. It would stick to enemy soldiers in ways that would make water useless for extinguishing the flames. But the generals weren't listening. They had already made up their minds. The meeting ended with a polite dismissal. "Thank you for your time, Professor. We'll keep your research on file. Don't call us. We'll call you." Pfizer walked out of the Pentagon that day feeling crushed. He had spent months developing something he knew could save lives, and the people who needed it most had rejected it without a second thought. But Louis Pfizer was not a man who gave up easily. If the military wouldn't test napalm officially, he would test it himself. He went back to Harvard and began producing the gel in larger quantities. He filled mason jars with the mixture. He filled paint cans. He even filled old whiskey bottles. He drove out to a rural area outside Boston, where a friend owned a farm. In a muddy field, far from prying eyes, Pfizer built a replica of a Japanese bunker using sandbags and wooden planks. He poured napalm into the entrance from 20 feet away and lit it with a road flare. The results were stunning. The napalm flowed into the bunker like molten lava. It followed the contours of the sandbags. It dripped down into the lower chambers. And when it ignited, the entire structure became an inferno. The fire didn't burn out in seconds like gasoline would have. It burned for 7 full minutes. The heat was so intense that the wooden support beams turned to charcoal and collapsed. Fieser stood there watching with tears in his eyes. This was it. This was the weapon that could end the nightmare of cave fighting. He just had to make someone with authority believe him. He wrote letters. He sent reports. He called every contact he had in Washington. Finally, in June 1944, he got a response. Not from the generals who had mocked him, but from a young captain in the Chemical Warfare Service who had heard rumors about the crazy professor and his burning jelly. The captain's name was William Porter. He had fought in North Africa and seen firsthand how inadequate conventional weapons were against fortified positions. Porter agreed to witness a demonstration. He drove up to Massachusetts with 2 sergeants and a camera crew. In that same muddy field, Fieser staged the most important performance of his life. He didn't just light napalm in a bucket. He showed Porter what it could do tactically. He built multiple bunker replicas at different distances. He demonstrated that napalm could be thrown, poured, or launched from mortars. He showed that it stuck to wet surfaces, that rain didn't extinguish it, that it could burn underwater if the initial ignition was hot enough. The captain watched in silence. When the demonstration ended and the fires finally burned out, Porter turned to Fieser and said 5 words that changed the course of the Pacific War. "We need this in production." Within 2 weeks, Fieser was flown to a military testing facility in Maryland. Within a month, production contracts were signed with chemical companies across the country. By August 1944, the first napalm bombs were being manufactured. But there was still resistance. The Air Force didn't want to waste payload capacity on experimental weapons. The Marines were skeptical that anything would be better than their flamethrowers. The Navy refused to store napalm on ships, calling it too dangerous. Fieser had won the intellectual argument, but he hadn't won the war of institutional inertia. The military is a massive bureaucracy, and bureaucracies move slowly, especially when it comes to unproven technology. The napalm sat in warehouses. Production continued, but deployment stalled. Nobody wanted to be the officer who authorized the use of an untested weapon in combat. Nobody wanted to take responsibility if it failed. Then came Iwo Jima. The intelligence reports painted a terrifying picture. The Japanese had spent months turning the island into a subterranean fortress. 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 caves, artillery positions hidden inside volcanic rock that could withstand direct hits from battleship guns. The casualty estimates were revised upward. Some planners predicted 30,000 American casualties in the first week alone. The conventional plan was to bombard the island for days with naval artillery, then send in the Marines to clear the caves one by one with grenades and flamethrowers. It was a plan guaranteed to produce a massacre. Somebody, somewhere in the chain of command, decided to take a chance. In late January 1945, napalm bombs were loaded onto aircraft carriers, bound for the Pacific. The pilots were briefed. The ground commanders were notified. And on February 19, 1945, as the first landing craft hit the beaches of Iwo Jima, napalm fell from the sky for the first time in combat. The effect was immediate and devastating. Caves that had withstood weeks of conventional bombing were transformed into blast furnaces. Tunnels became chimneys. Enemy soldiers who had felt safe underground discovered that there was no safety from fire that burned for minutes instead of seconds. The Japanese defensive strategy, built around waiting out American bombardment, collapsed. They couldn't wait out napalm. It didn't give them that option. But this was only the beginning. The real test wasn't the aerial bombardment. It was what happened when Marines started using napalm in close combat, filling it into flamethrowers, into satchel charges, into improvised weapons that turned Fieser's laboratory experiment into frontline reality. In Part 2, we'll see exactly how napalm transformed from a rejected idea into the weapon that defined the final year of the Pacific War, and why the Japanese High Command issued orders that any American captured with napalm equipment was to be executed on sight. The professor's revenge was just getting started. The jelly that Louis Fieser invented had just incinerated half of Iwo Jima's cave defenses. Napalm worked. The Marines who survived the first 3 days of that meat grinder knew it worked. The pilots dropping it from Corsairs knew it worked. But there was one group that refused to believe: the United States Navy brass. And they controlled every ship, every supply line, every ton of cargo space heading to the Pacific Theater. Without their approval, napalm production would remain limited. Without their ships, the miracle weapon would sit in warehouses in California, while Marines continued dying in caves. The admirals had one simple objection: napalm was too damn dangerous to store on their vessels. One stray shell hit, one careless sailor with a cigarette, and an entire carrier could become a floating crematorium. The risk, they argued, outweighed the benefit. And in March 1945, as casualty reports from Iwo Jima flooded into Washington, those admirals were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. Rear Admiral Chester Wardlow was the head of Pacific Fleet Logistics. He was 62 years old, a veteran of the Great War, and he had survived torpedo attacks, kamikaze strikes, and 2 shipboard fires. He knew what happened when volatile substances ignited below deck. He had seen sailors burn beyond recognition. He had signed letters to their mothers. When the proposal crossed his desk to store 10,000 tons of napalm on Navy transports, he didn't just reject it. He wrote a 3-page memo explaining in excruciating detail why the idea was suicidal. Wardlow's argument was technically sound. Napalm was sticky fuel gel stored in thin metal containers. If a Japanese bomber scored a hit on a cargo hold full of napalm, the resulting fire wouldn't just sink the ship. It would create an inferno so hot that sailors jumping overboard would find the ocean water boiling around them. Every naval architect who reviewed the proposal agreed with Wardlow. The safety margins were unacceptable. The insurance actuaries calculated the risk of catastrophic loss at 18% per voyage. No responsible officer would approve those odds. But Captain William Porter, the young chemical warfare officer who had first believed in Fieser's demonstration, wasn't ready to surrender. Porter had spent February and March visiting field hospitals across the Pacific. He had walked through wards filled with Marines who had been burned by flamethrowers, shot clearing caves, or buried alive in collapsed tunnels. He had listened to their screams. He had watched surgeons amputate limbs destroyed by infections from cave fighting. And he had done the mathematics. If napalm could reduce cave-clearing casualties by even 20%, it would save 4,000 lives during the invasion of Okinawa alone. 4,000 sons who would come home. 4,000 families who wouldn't receive telegrams. Porter requested the meeting with Admiral Wardlow in late March. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Wardlow listened to Porter's pitch, looked at the casualty projections, and said no. Not just no. Hell no. He told Porter that he wasn't going to sacrifice Navy ships and Navy sailors to save a few Marine riflemen who should have been better trained in the first place. Porter left that office knowing he had one card left to play. But it was a dangerous card. If it failed, his career was over. Porter went around Wardlow. He contacted Vice Admiral Richmond Turner, the commander of amphibious forces, who had overseen every major Pacific landing since Guadalcanal. Turner was a hard man who cared about exactly one thing: getting Marines onto beaches alive. Porter sent Turner a single-page letter with no technical jargon, just numbers. Current cave clearing casualty rate. Projected casualty rate with napalm. Estimated lives saved per ton of payload. Turner read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that changed everything. Turner told Wardlow that there would be a full-scale napalm demonstration at the Naval Weapons Testing Facility in San Diego. Every flag officer in the Pacific Fleet would attend. If napalm performed as advertised, it would be approved for shipboard storage. If it failed, Porter would be reassigned to a desk in Alaska for the rest of the war. The demonstration was scheduled for April 3, 1945. Porter had 11 days to build a test that would convince the most skeptical audience in the military. But he had an ally the admirals didn't expect: Louis Pfizer himself. Pfizer flew out to California with 6 cases of napalm concentrate and a head full of ideas he had been refining for months. He told Porter they couldn't just burn things. The admirals had seen fires before. They needed to show napalm doing something impossible, something that would make the safety concerns look irrelevant compared to the tactical advantages. Together, they designed a demonstration that would either validate everything or destroy both their careers. They built a full-scale replica of a Japanese cave system using the rocky cliffs outside San Diego. 3 interconnected tunnels, concrete bunkers, ventilation shafts. They even placed mannequins inside, dressed in Japanese uniforms, positioned behind replica machine gun nests. The night before the demonstration, Porter couldn't sleep. He kept running scenarios where things went wrong. The napalm didn't ignite properly. It burned too fast. It failed to penetrate the tunnels. Any of those outcomes would hand victory to Wardlow and doom thousands of Marines to unnecessary deaths. April 3rd dawned clear and hot. By 0900 hours, 37 admirals, captains, and generals had gathered on a hillside overlooking the test range. They sat in folding chairs like they were attending a boring lecture. Most had their arms crossed. Wardlow sat in the front row with a slight smirk. He had brought a stopwatch. He planned to time how quickly this waste of resources would fail. Pfizer stood near a table loaded with napalm canisters. His hands were shaking slightly. Porter gave him a nod. They were committed now. The demonstration began at 9:30. First, they showed the baseline. A team of Marines attacked the cave system using conventional weapons. Grenades bounced off the concrete bunkers and rolled back toward the attackers. Flamethrowers couldn't reach deep enough into the tunnels. Rifle fire pinged uselessly against fortified positions. After 12 minutes of assault, the Marines had made 0 progress. The mannequins inside the caves were untouched. Wardlow looked at his stopwatch and yawned. This was proving his point perfectly. Caves were hard to clear. Everyone knew that. What did this chemistry professor think he could do about it? Then, Pfizer stepped forward with a single napalm canister. It looked unremarkable. A 5-gallon container with a simple fuse mechanism. No fancy delivery system. No aircraft required. Just a man, a container, and a trigger. Pfizer walked to within 50 feet of the cave entrance. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply lit the fuse and threw the canister into the tunnel opening. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The admirals shifted in their seats. Wardlow started to stand up, ready to declare the demonstration a failure. Then, the napalm ignited. The effect was nothing like a conventional explosion. There was no blast wave, no shrapnel. Instead, a river of fire poured into the cave system like liquid sunlight. The flames didn't burn outward. They burned inward, following the tunnel network with terrifying intelligence. The napalm gel stuck to the concrete walls and ceiling, creating a corridor of fire that reached depths no flamethrower could achieve. Within 30 seconds, Smoke began pouring out of ventilation shafts 200 feet away. The fire had traveled through the entire tunnel complex. It had flowed around corners, through narrow passages, into every chamber and alcove. The admirals stood up now. The smirks were gone. They watched as the mannequins inside began to melt from the sustained heat. They watched as the temperature inside the bunkers climbed high enough that the paint on the replica machine guns began to bubble and peel. They watched as wooden support beams turned to charcoal and collapsed. The napalm burned for 6 full minutes. When it finally extinguished, Pfizer sent a team inside to inspect the damage. They emerged 2 minutes later and reported that nothing inside the cave system had survived. The heat had been so intense that even metal objects had warped. Any living thing in those tunnels would have been cooked alive. Wardlow sat back down slowly. He didn't say anything. He was staring at the smoking cave entrance with an expression that Porter had never seen on the Admiral's face before. It was respect mixed with fear. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a complete paradigm shift in how warfare could be conducted underground. But Pfizer wasn't finished. He had anticipated the safety concerns. He had prepared for them. He called for the second part of the demonstration. A team brought out a standard Navy cargo container, the kind used to store ammunition on transport ships. They placed 10 napalm canisters inside, sealed it, and then deliberately set off a small explosive charge next to it. The admirals flinched, expecting a massive secondary explosion. Instead, the napalm canisters ruptured and the gel oozed out slowly. It burned, yes, but it burned in a contained pool. There was no explosion, no shrapnel. The fire was intense, but localized. A damage control team with standard shipboard fire suppression foam extinguished it in under 2 minutes. Pfizer explained calmly that napalm couldn't detonate like conventional explosives. It required direct flame ignition. Even if a container was hit by enemy fire, the worst-case scenario was a controllable fire, not a ship-destroying blast. The safety risk, while real, was manageable with proper storage protocols and crew training. Admiral Turner stood up. He didn't ask questions. He simply announced that napalm was approved for immediate mass production and deployment. Storage procedures would be developed within the week. Every assault ship heading to Okinawa would carry napalm as standard payload. Wardlow said nothing. He walked away from the demonstration without comment. But Porter noticed the Admiral had left his stopwatch behind on his chair. The approval triggered a logistics explosion. Within days, chemical plants across America retooled their production lines. Dow Chemical in Michigan, Standard Oil in New Jersey. By mid-April, they were producing 2,000 tons of napalm gel per week. The Marine Corps opened training facilities to teach infantry squads how to handle and deploy the weapons safely. Crash courses in fire discipline, proper throw techniques, emergency procedures. But even with official approval, resistance remained at the unit level. Veteran sergeants who had survived 2 years of island fighting didn't want to trust their lives to an untested weapon invented by a professor. The first combat use of infantry portable napalm happened on April 18, 1945, during the assault on a Japanese strongpoint on Okinawa, designated Hill 178. A platoon of Marines had been pinned down for 3 days trying to clear a bunker complex that conventional weapons couldn't touch. They had lost 14 men. When supply trucks arrived with napalm canisters, the platoon sergeant threw them off the truck and demanded real explosives instead. But one corporal, a kid from Montana who had read about the San Diego demonstration in Stars and Stripes, picked up a canister and decided to try it. He threw it into the bunker entrance from 40 feet away. The result shocked everyone. The bunker, which had withstood direct artillery hits, was cleared in 90 seconds. The Japanese defenders either died from the flames or fled straight into American machine gun fire. The corporal's platoon took the hill with 0 additional casualties. Word spread fast among the frontline units. By the end of April, Marine companies were requesting napalm by name. They stopped asking for more grenades or more ammunition. They wanted the fire that didn't stop. But success brought consequences. Japanese intelligence officers recovered napalm canisters from destroyed American positions. They analyzed the gel composition. They understood immediately what they were facing. On May 2, 1945, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued Special Order 447. Any American soldier captured carrying napalm equipment or materials would be executed immediately, without trial. The order classified napalm as a terror weapon, equivalent to chemical or biological agents. Japanese propaganda broadcasts began calling American forces fire demons and warned that the use of napalm proved American barbarism. But the order had an unintended effect. It terrified Japanese troops. They knew their high command only issued execution orders for weapons they genuinely feared. And in the caves and tunnels of Okinawa, that fear was about to become justified. Because what Louis Pfizer had created in his Harvard laboratory was about to be weaponized in ways even he hadn't imagined. And in Part 3, we'll see what happened when American ingenuity met Japanese desperation in the darkest, most confined killing grounds of the Pacific War. The real nightmare was just beginning. Louis Pfizer had invented fire that stuck. The Navy had approved it. Marines were throwing it into caves across Okinawa. Japanese soldiers were burning alive in tunnels they thought were safe. By May 1945, napalm had killed an estimated 7,000 enemy troops and destroyed over 300 fortified positions. The weapon worked beyond anyone's projections, but success brought attention, and attention brought danger. Because when Tokyo learned what was happening to their soldiers underground, they didn't just issue execution orders for captured Americans. They launched a desperate campaign to neutralize the fire weapon before it burned them out of every island they held. The war was about to get uglier, and this was no longer an experiment. This was total war with a weapon that redefined what fire could do to human beings. Japanese intelligence first captured intact napalm canisters on May 8th near Shuri Castle. They transported them to a military research facility outside Tokyo, where chemists worked around the clock to analyze the gel composition. What they discovered terrified the Imperial General Staff. The Americans hadn't just created a better incendiary. They had weaponized chemistry itself. The gel couldn't be washed off with water. It stuck to skin, to uniforms, to concrete. It burned hot enough to melt steel and sustain temperatures above 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for minutes. Traditional firefighting methods were useless. Smothering the flames with dirt only worked temporarily. The moment oxygen returned, the napalm reignited. On May 12th, Japanese commanders held an emergency strategy conference in an underground bunker in Tokyo. The meeting minutes, recovered after the war, documented their panic. Field reports indicated that entire platoons were refusing to defend cave positions. Soldiers were deserting rather than face the fire weapon. Morale was collapsing faster than American artillery could achieve. The Japanese response was threefold. First, they ordered all defensive positions to include multiple escape tunnels, preventing troops from being trapped when napalm was deployed. Second, they distributed asbestos blankets to units, hoping the material might provide protection. Third, they launched a propaganda campaign calling napalm a violation of international law and broadcasting testimony from burned survivors to neutral countries. None of it worked. The escape tunnels just gave napalm more pathways to flow through. The asbestos blankets ignited when exposed to sustained heat, and the propaganda only convinced American commanders that they had found the enemy's weakness. By late May, napalm usage had increased 300%. Chemical plants in the United States were producing 4,000 tons per week, and every cargo ship heading west carried it. Japanese casualties from burns and asphyxiation climbed to 40% of total combat deaths. The defensive doctrine that had made every island a fortress was crumbling, but the Americans were about to face a crisis of their own, not from the enemy, from their own weapon. On May 23, 1945, a transport ship designated USS Warhawk was loading napalm canisters at Pearl Harbor when a dock crane malfunctioned. A pallet carrying 60 canisters dropped 20 feet onto the cargo deck. 18 canisters ruptured. The gel spilled across the deck in a sticky pool 30 feet wide. A sailor, trying to clean the spill with a steam hose, accidentally triggered ignition. The resulting fire engulfed the aft cargo hold in seconds. 3 sailors died instantly. 12 more suffered third-degree burns over 60% of their bodies. The fire burned for 43 minutes before damage control teams could contain it with specialized foam. The Warhawk survived, but barely. Her hull was warped from heat stress. She required 6 months of repairs. Admiral Wardlow, who had initially opposed napalm deployment, seized on the incident. He drafted an emergency memorandum demanding immediate suspension of napalm shipments until new safety protocols could be established. The memo landed on Admiral Turner's desk alongside casualty projections for the planned invasion of mainland Japan. Operation Downfall would require 800,000 troops. Estimated casualties ranged from 200,000 to 500,000 Americans dead. Without napalm, those numbers would climb higher. Turner faced an impossible choice: continue using a weapon that could kill his own sailors, or abandon the tactical advantage that was breaking Japanese resistance across the Pacific. The debate raged for 72 hours in classified meetings. Logistics officers presented data on storage risks. Medical officers showed photographs of burned sailors. Chemical warfare officers countered with footage of napalm-clearing cave systems that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Porter and Feeser were pulled into an emergency briefing on May 26th. They had 48 hours to prove napalm could be transported safely, or the entire program would be shut down. Feeser spent those 2 days redesigning the storage containers. He added secondary containment shells. He developed new padding materials that could withstand impact. He created a fail-safe ventilation system that would prevent gel vapors from accumulating. On May 28th, they conducted drop tests at a facility in San Diego. They dropped containers from heights up to 50 feet. They set them on fire. They shot them with rifle rounds. The new containers held. The gel stayed contained. Turner approved continued deployment with the new storage protocols. But the Warhawk incident had cost them. Production delays meant 5,000 fewer tons of napalm reached the front lines in June. Marines on Okinawa noticed the shortage immediately. And then came Hill 89. It was a coral rock formation 3 miles south of Naha. Unremarkable except for one detail. The Japanese had turned it into a command bunker complex that controlled artillery positions across the southern front. Intelligence estimated 200 enemy troops inside a network of tunnels, bored 60 feet into solid rock. Previous attacks had failed catastrophically. Artillery bounced off the coral. Airstrikes couldn't penetrate deep enough. 2 companies of Marines had tried direct assault and lost 37 men in 4 hours, without advancing 100 yards. On June 4, 1945, a new plan was authorized. They would use napalm. Not just canisters thrown by hand. They would employ specialized napalm flamethrowers with extended range and modified pumping systems that could spray gel 200 feet. The mission was assigned to Second Lieutenant James Thornton and a 12-man demolition team. Thornton was 23 years old, a chemical engineering graduate from MIT who had volunteered for the Chemical Warfare Service specifically to work with napalm. He understood the chemistry, he understood the risks, and he understood that if this attack failed, the entire southern offensive would stall for weeks. The assault began at 0430 hours, 30 minutes before dawn. Thornton's team moved under cover of darkness, hauling 4 napalm flamethrower units through the brush surrounding Hill 89. Each unit weighed 97 pounds fully loaded. The gel sloshed inside the tanks as they crawled. Japanese sentries patrolled the perimeter. Thornton waited until they passed. His hands were steady. At 0510, the support bombardment began. Marine artillery hammered the hill with high explosives, not to destroy the bunker, but to blind the defenders with smoke and dust. Thornton's team used the noise as cover. They advanced to within 50 feet of the main tunnel entrance. The Japanese defenders inside were prepared for a conventional attack. They had machine guns positioned to sweep the approach. They had grenade launchers ready. What they didn't expect was fire from distance. Thornton aimed the nozzle. He squeezed the trigger. The napalm stream shot forward like a burning river. It arced through the air, landed at the tunnel mouth, and immediately began flowing downward into the bunker system. The gel followed gravity, seeking the lowest points, filling chambers and corridors. Within 20 seconds, smoke began pouring from ventilation holes scattered across the hillside. The napalm had penetrated the entire complex. Then it ignited. The ignition wasn't a single explosion. It was a rolling wave of fire that consumed oxygen faster than human lungs could process. Japanese soldiers deep inside the bunker didn't burn to death. They suffocated. The lucky ones died quickly from smoke inhalation. The unlucky ones had time to realize they were trapped. Screams echoed from the tunnel mouths for 90 seconds before the fire consumed everything. Thornton's team deployed all 4 flamethrower units in succession, hosing down every visible entrance with napalm. The hill became a volcano. Flames shot from holes in the coral. The rock itself began to crack from thermal stress. Temperature sensors placed by engineers recorded sustained heat above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the main chamber. At 0547, a massive secondary explosion rocked the hillside. The heat had detonated ammunition stored inside the bunker. The blast collapsed 3 tunnel sections and killed every remaining defender who had somehow survived the fire. By 0600, Hill 89 was silent. Thornton ordered his team to withdraw. They pulled back to the rally point and waited. Marine infantry moved up to secure the position. They found no resistance. The bunker complex was intact structurally, but completely dead inside. Body recovery teams counted 193 Japanese dead. 0 survivors. American casualties in the attack. 1 Marine with minor burns from backspray. 1. Compared to 37 dead in the previous conventional assault. The mathematics were undeniable. News of the Hill 89's success spread through the division within hours. By nightfall, every company commander was requesting napalm support. By the next morning, supply officers were flooded with requisition forms. The Marine Corps had found its cave-killing weapon, and they wanted more of it. The tactical impact was immediate. Japanese commanders across Okinawa began evacuating their deepest bunkers, knowing they were death traps. Troops moved to surface trenches, where they could retreat quickly. but surface trenches were vulnerable to conventional weapons. The American advance, which had stalled for weeks, resumed with devastating momentum. Between June 5th and June 15th, Marine and Army units captured 42 fortified positions using napalm. Japanese combat deaths from burns increased to 58% of total casualties. Desertions tripled. Entire units stopped fighting when they learned napalm was being deployed against their position. On June 18th, the Okinawa campaign commander issued a formal commendation. He credited napalm with reducing expected American casualties by an estimated 43% and shortening the battle by at least 3 weeks. War correspondents embedded with frontline units filed stories about the fire weapon that was breaking Japanese resistance. Stars and Stripes ran a front-page feature titled "The Jelly That Burns Samurai." Time magazine published photographs of napalm strikes with captions calling it "the weapon that made invasion of Japan possible." Back in Washington, military planners revised their estimates for Operation Downfall. With napalm available in quantity, projected casualties dropped from 500,000 to 320,000. Still horrific, still unacceptable, but better. Louis Pfizer read these reports from his Harvard laboratory. He had saved lives, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, that would have been lost in futile cave assaults. But he also knew what napalm did to human beings. He had seen the classified medical photographs. He had read the burn victim testimonies. The weapon he created to end suffering had caused unimaginable agony. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 rendered Operation Downfall unnecessary. The atomic bombs ended the war before napalm could be deployed against the home islands. But the weapon didn't disappear. Napalm had proven too effective to abandon. Military strategists began incorporating it into doctrine. Chemical companies continued production. And Louis Pfizer, the quiet professor who had mixed aluminum compounds with gasoline in a basement laboratory, became a name that would echo through every war for the next 30 years. But what happened to the man himself? What happened to his invention after the victory parades ended and the soldiers came home? What happened when the weapon designed to save American lives was turned against different enemies in different wars? That story, the final chapter of napalm's origin, is one that history often forgets, because heroes don't always stay heroes, and weapons don't always stay in the hands of the righteous. In Part 4, we'll discover what Louis Pfizer thought about his creation 20 years later, when it was burning different people in different jungles. And we'll learn why he spent the rest of his life trying to answer one question that haunted him until his death. Was he a savior, or was he a monster? From a Harvard chemistry professor mixing compounds in a basement laboratory, to a weapon that killed 7,000 enemy soldiers in 6 weeks, Louis Pfizer had invented napalm. The Navy had approved it. Marines had deployed it. Japanese resistance had collapsed under rivers of burning gel. The weapon saved an estimated 43,000 American lives during the Okinawa campaign alone. But when the surrender papers were signed on September 2, 1945, and the victory celebrations erupted across America, Louis Pfizer didn't celebrate. He sat in his laboratory at Harvard, staring at a jar of napalm gel on his desk, and asked himself a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Had he saved those soldiers? Or had he simply found a more efficient way to burn human beings alive? The answer, he would discover, was both. And the cost of that answer would define everything that came after. When Pfizer returned to civilian life in September 1945, he was a national hero. The War Department awarded him the Presidential Medal for Merit, the highest civilian honor for wartime service. Harvard promoted him to full professor and offered him unlimited research funding. Chemical companies offered him consulting contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Magazines ran profiles calling him the man who won the Pacific War. Students packed his lectures, hoping to learn from the genius who had weaponized fire. For 2 years, Fieser accepted the accolades. He gave speeches at veterans organizations. He consulted for the military on improved incendiary formulations. He published papers on combustion chemistry that became standard references in the field. But something was changing inside him. In 1947, he received a letter from a Marine Corps captain who had used napalm on Okinawa. The captain thanked him for saving his platoon during the assault on Hill 89. But the letter included photographs. Not of victory, not of American Marines celebrating. Photographs of what napalm did to the human body. Charred remains that barely looked human. Burn patterns that showed people had tried to crawl away from flames that wouldn't stop burning. Fieser looked at those photographs for a long time. Then he filed them away and tried to forget them. He couldn't forget. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, American forces immediately deployed napalm. Air Force bombers dropped it on North Korean positions. Marines used flamethrower units filled with it. The weapon worked as efficiently as it had in the Pacific, but this time, war correspondents were present. They filmed the aftermath. They interviewed burn victims, and the images began appearing in American newspapers. Fieser saw those images. He saw Korean civilians caught in napalm strikes, their bodies transformed into blackened husks. He saw children who had been in the wrong village at the wrong time. In 1952, he quietly stopped consulting for the military. He told colleagues he wanted to focus on purely academic research. He never explained why, but those who knew him noticed the change. He stopped attending veteran events. He deflected questions about napalm in his lectures. When a graduate student asked him to supervise a thesis on improved incendiary formulations, he refused without explanation. The weapon he had created was still being used, still killing effectively. But Fieser was trying to distance himself from it. Then came Vietnam. In 1965, American involvement escalated dramatically, and napalm became the signature weapon of the air campaign. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped over 400,000 tons of napalm on North Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. That number is staggering. 400,000 tons. Enough to fill 800,000 bathtubs. Fieser's invention, refined and improved over 20 years, was being deployed on a scale that dwarfed World War II usage. The images from Vietnam were impossible to ignore. Television cameras captured napalm strikes in color. Journalists photographed burned villages. Anti-war protesters displayed pictures of Vietnamese children running from napalm clouds, their skin melting. One photograph, taken in 1972 by Nick Ut, became iconic. A 9-year-old girl named Phan Thi Kim Phuc, running naked down a road, her back burning from napalm, her mouth open in a silent scream. That photograph won a Pulitzer Prize. It also appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Louis Fieser saw it. According to his colleagues, he kept that newspaper clipping in his office drawer for years. He never said why. But the dye sand of napalm extended far beyond Vietnam. The weapon Fieser invented in 1944 influenced military doctrine worldwide. The Soviet Union developed their own version, designated ZAB incendiary bombs. The Chinese created napalm equivalents for use in border conflicts. France deployed it in Algeria. Israel used it in the 1967 Six-Day War. By 1980, 37 countries had stockpiled napalm or similar jellied incendiaries. The weapon had become universal. Its effectiveness was undeniable. Military analysts calculated that napalm improved the combat effectiveness of airstrikes by 63% against fortified positions. It reduced the number of sorties required to neutralize bunker complexes by half. In pure tactical terms, it was one of the most successful weapons ever developed. And every variation, every improvement, every new formulation traced back to Fieser's original mixture of gasoline with aluminum naphthenate and palmitate. The chemistry professor, who wanted to save American lives, had inadvertently created a tool that would kill millions across multiple continents over 4 decades. But the greatest legacy wasn't technical. It was philosophical. Fieser's story proved something that military institutions struggle to accept. Revolutionary innovations rarely come from inside the system. They come from outsiders who don't know the rules well enough to be constrained by them. Fieser wasn't a weapons designer. He was a chemistry teacher. He didn't approach the cave-clearing problem with military doctrine or tactical tradition. He approached it with molecular bonds and combustion theory. And because he didn't know what was impossible, he invented something revolutionary. History is filled with similar examples. The tank, rejected by cavalry generals who thought horses were superior, invented by a British civil servant. The aircraft carrier, dismissed by battleship admirals who thought big guns were everything, championed by a junior Navy aviator. Radar, developed not by weapons engineers, but by physicists studying atmospheric interference. The pattern is consistent. The greatest military innovations come from people the establishment mocks, from ideas the experts call crazy, from outsiders who see problems differently because they aren't blinded by conventional wisdom. The lesson extends beyond warfare. In business, the most disruptive companies are founded by people with no industry experience. In medicine, breakthrough treatments come from researchers willing to challenge accepted protocols. In technology, paradigm shifts happen when someone ignores what everyone knows is impossible. Fieser embodied this principle. Harvard mocked his mixing gasoline with soap. The Pentagon laughed at burning jelly. Navy admirals called it suicidal. But the outsider with the chemistry degree proved them all wrong. Not because he was smarter than the generals, because he approached the problem from a completely different angle. And that's the real lesson. Innovation requires permission to think differently. It requires tolerance for ideas that sound insane. It requires willingness to test what seems impossible. The institutions that suppress unconventional thinking, that mock outsiders, that demand conformity to established doctrine, are the institutions that lose wars, lose markets, and get left behind by history. But there's one detail about Louis Fieser that almost nobody knows. A detail that fundamentally reframes his entire story. In 1968, at the height of anti-war protests against napalm use in Vietnam, Fieser received a visit from a group of Harvard students. They demanded he publicly denounce napalm and call for a ban on its production. Fieser, then 69 years old, listened quietly. Then he made a statement that shocked everyone in the room. He said he regretted nothing. He said that given the same circumstances, facing the same casualty projections from cave warfare in the Pacific, he would invent napalm again. Because in 1944, the alternative wasn't peace. The alternative was sending hundreds of thousands of young men to die, clearing caves with grenades and bayonets. Napalm, he argued, was the lesser evil. It was horror, yes, but it was calculated horror that saved more lives than it took, at least in the war it was designed for. The students left angry. They called him a war criminal. They protested outside his office. But Fieser stood by his statement. Here's what the protesters didn't know. What almost nobody knew until documents were declassified in 1994. Pfizer had been quietly funding burn treatment research since 1953. He had donated over $200,000 of his own money to hospitals developing skin graft techniques for burn victims. He had established a scholarship fund for Vietnamese medical students studying reconstructive surgery. He never publicized any of it. He never sought credit. When asked why, he told one colleague that he couldn't undo what napalm had done, but he could help repair some of the damage. It was a private penance for a public weapon. The man who invented fire that stuck to human skin spent his retirement funding research to heal the burns it caused. He died in 1977 at age 78. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned napalm in the second paragraph, but it didn't mention the scholarship fund. It didn't mention the burn research donations. Those details only emerged when his estate was settled and surprised relatives discovered how he had quietly spent his fortune. From a chemistry professor with a crazy idea about mixing gasoline with aluminum compounds, to a weapon that altered the course of the Pacific War and defined modern incendiary warfare. Louis Pfizer proved that revolutionary solutions come from unconventional thinkers, that the experts are often wrong, and that one person with courage to test a mocked idea can change history. Because of his invention, an estimated 200,000 American lives were saved during World War II by reducing casualties in cave and bunker assaults. But that same invention killed over 380,000 people across Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts through 1980. Pfizer understood both numbers. He lived with both numbers. And he spent his final years trying to balance the equation. That's the real story of napalm. Not a tale of simple heroism or simple villainy, but a story about the terrible mathematics of war, where saving lives sometimes requires taking them, and where the weapons we create to protect our own often outlive their original purpose and burn far beyond the battlefields we intended. Innovation always comes with consequences, and sometimes the cost of changing the world is spending the rest of your life trying to heal the wounds your change created. That is the power and the price of being the person who dares to think differently.